Okay, here we go. This is a fun one. This is on epigenetics. And epigenetics basically is about life. So we're going to kind of learn this a little bit differently than what we've previously known or what you've previously been taught, especially if you're from my generation, if you're from, the 1960s is when I was born. And so we were taught this totally different than the way we're looking at things now. On up through probably the 90s, I can imagine that this has been taught in schools. I can't imagine that the textbooks have changed a whole lot, so I would imagine the old standard of thinking still is being taught and is thought to be truth by most. But what we're learning and what we know now is totally different. And so that's what I'm going to go over here with you now. This is just a very basic overview. I am not a scientist. I've said that quite a few times, but my understanding of this has taken me to a whole different place in my life and what I think and how I think this all operates. And that's basically what has brought me to the point that I'm bringing things out and sharing them with people, is because I think we need to understand it differently. I think we need to know what the difference is and how the body actually operates, because it gives you a whole different realm to operate in. So we're going to dig right into this one. This is in module, I believe module 6. So we're going to jump right into it. So by definition, if you look up epigenetics, it's the study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than the alteration of the genetic code itself. So we've talked about the genetic code in science for years, right? We've known about the genetic code, that code is what makes you up. It's what gives you, as well as personality, it gives you traits as far as hair color, body size, eye color, skin tone, right? That genetic code, basically what we had taught and what we learned was that genetic code makes you who you are. So epigenetics is coming at it from a different angle and saying that modifying the expression of the gene, which is getting the gene itself to do something else, and we're modifying it by its surroundings. We're modifying it by the environment that you put it into. And we'll talk about what that means here in a second. Instead of actually altering the genetic code, and you can think of altering a genetic code, if you think about the produce that we have in this country, and you remember GMOs, right? They're genetically modified organisms. And what they did was actually take apart the genetic structure or take apart the DNA and either take something out or insert something. They inserted something that they wanted the produce to do, or they took something out that they didn't want it to do. So they've modified produce, they've modified all kinds of things actually, the animals and all kinds of different things, but for size, right? So all the apples look the same, so that they're bigger, so that the color is brighter, right? They've done all kinds of modifications. They actually have modified produce that produces its own pesticides, which is horrifying and really scary if you're eating that. And pesticide is a known, like it's a poison, right? It kills things. So, that's a whole nother discussion. But when you think about genetic code alterations, that's a good one to look at, because then it kind of makes a little sense. And so we're talking about modifying the gene expression, which is getting the gene just to participate and do something different based on what you surround it with. So that's what we're talking about. That's what epigenetics is about. And so we're going to go right into a little bit of really simple, basic cellular biology. Do you know that there are 50 to 75 trillion cells that make up the human body? I want you to stop and just think about that for a second, right? If you're an energy person and you feel energy the way I do sometimes, I want you to stop and just see if you can feel those cells buzzing. Notice what you feel about your body. It can be really interesting when you stop and breathe into that for a second, right? Each one of those cells is a living individual. I was listening to a program, it may have been Bruce Lipton, I'm not sure, not too long ago, and he said, take a step back and look in the mirror for a second and see if you can visualize yourself as each one of those little cells. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? There's not one function in the human body that's not present in every cell that makes up the human being. What does that mean? So every function that's represented inside of your body, everything that your body does, digestion, respiration, your excretory system, the musculoskeletal, endocrine, the reproductive system, nervous system, immune system, and all your receptors, right? And so I just listed a few: the olfactory, taste receptors, sight and light receptors. Every one of those receptors are included inside every single functioning cell of your body. Every one of them does every one of those things. Every cell has digestion. Every cell has respiration. Every cell excretes its waste. Every cell has a musculoskeletal frame to it. Every cell has an endocrine system. Every cell has a reproductive system. Okay, so within each one of those cells, and we talked about, I just now mentioned all the receptors. So olfactory is your sense of smell. You have all these receptors inside your nose that allow you to smell all of these different things, and it's trillions of different cells that they're tuned to. Taste receptors all in your mouth, your sight and light receptors, right? Part of your eyes, part of your sight. Each one of your cells also contain those receptors. And that by itself is a really interesting thing. Why would you have taste receptors or smell receptors, the olfactory receptors? Why would you have those in every cell of your body? What is what is that function? What do they do? And I'll be doing a separate video on that at some point, so keep your eyes open for that. Just a really interesting and curious thing to talk about. Why is this even important? Well, it's important because for the last 50 years, we've been led to believe that the control of our being lied in the makeup of something that we have supposedly no control over. That your DNA holds all of the cards, right? So your DNA, and we're going to talk more about what that is what tells you what you're going to be, how tall you are, your hair color. They even thought it gave you your personality traits, and it held disease markers. So the diseases that you may or may not get if you were going to have weight issues, right? We were told that the diseases, the physical traits, and all the things that you're born with or acquire over time are something written in a code that's locked tight in your body, and that code's your DNA. It's that genetic code. And you don't have a choice. It's what you're born with. There's no choice to this. That the people, if you think about people through all walks of life, you've probably heard of these people that are able to change it through things like laughter therapy or a really good, strong prayer. Right? We call that the miracle kind of idea, right? That those were just flukes, and that's not the normal. It's not the norm. That people who would end up with a disease or have an issue, have something going on inside their body, and they could change it through doing something like laughter, through doing something like prayer, maybe through a meditation process, but something involving just the mind. That's a fluke, and that's not the norm. Why is that? Why do we think that way? Why do we think that's not normal? So what exactly are we talking about? So we're talking about genes, right? Genes contain a small piece of matter that's written in code that's called your DNA, right? That's the matter. What is the DNA? It's the genetic code. DNA is like a little instruction book that contains the information that tells a cell how to make a specific protein. And when it does that, when it's in the right environment, and with that protein, when it comes that protein, you end up with a different kind of tissue, basically. So you could end up with heart tissue. You could end up with liver tissue. You could end up with muscle. You might end up with bone. You might end up with fat. Based on the environment that you surround that cell with, you will get different information. So we call that gene expression. This is the process by which the information inside a gene becomes a usable product, and that's the RNA or the protein. And that usable product becomes an organ, it becomes an amount of tissue, it becomes bone, it becomes something inside your body that's now usable to your life function. So here's what we thought we knew about genes. And this is bringing it down to a really easy to understand level. And this is kind of where I came from. If my mom was fat and I get her fat gene, I'm going to be fat. That's kind of how we thought it worked. And you can insert any disease title into that equation. If my mom had diabetes and I get her diabetes gene, I'm going to get diabetes. If my mom had MS and I get her MS gene, I'm going to get MS, right? My granddad had asthma because we were told that asthma skipped generations for some crazy unknown reason. And we get that asthma gene. You're going to get asthma, right? If somebody back there had Crohn's disease and I get that gene, I'm going to get Crohn's. If they have heart disease runs in families. It's a genetic trait. How about arthritis? Runs in families. We see it all the time. What about dementia? Keep naming disease titles. What has affected your life? Right? What are the disease titles that you can come up with that you can look back through your family history and say, yeah, that was our family? Cancer is a big one right now. Cancer over the last probably 20 years has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's affecting populations younger and younger and younger. Why is that? What's going on with the genes? What's going on with the genetic code that's causing this problem? So the diseases that I just now listed are only a small smattering of the ones that I have actually firsthand experience with. Right? We talked about cancer. How about something like AIDS? Is that a genetic thing? What are we saying? AIDS might be a bad example. AIDS is a bad example because that's contracted by lifestyle choices. That's what we thought we knew. That's what we were told. And we're going to come back to this, so I don't want you jumping off the handle here. We're going to come back to it. I'm going to explain it some more. But this is what we thought we knew. So let's go back to the cells for a second. In high schools across the world, kids are taught a basic view of a cell. It has many different parts inside of it. Some of the parts we think we know what they do, and we label these parts and we apply our knowledge to them. As kids in school, we learned what we were told, and we really never gave it a second thought, right? You learned what you were told. They opened a book, they showed it to us, they said this is the way it worked, and we said okay, right? And there may have been some, obviously that's how science changes over time, that second guessed it, but I never gave it a second thought. I just assumed at some point in my life I would have all the disease titles that my family had. I assumed over time that I would be fat just because all of them were. Right? So here's that picture of a human cell, just so you can kind of remember what all is in there. You've got all these little tiny pieces and parts, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but mitochondria might be one that you remember. That's the energy stores of the cell. There are ribosomes in there. There's lysome in there. What else we have? The Golgi body, right? That has to do with muscle. There's a nucleus, and chromosomes are inside the nucleus, right? There's all these little pieces and parts to this human cell. What we're interested in is what is the brain of the cell? What causes the cell to operate and function? So we're taught the brain of a cell, much like the human brain, is where the big stuff occurs, right? Our human brain is kind of the central functioning system of our body. In the human body, the brain creates the mechanisms for the body to live and survive. It regulates every other organ to some extent, and without it, you would die. We can agree on that, right? Can you live without your brain? I've never met a person who did not have a brain. So like many other things, we made a deduction. We deduced that the brain is the organ that tells the body what to do and keeps it functioning properly. Without it, the body can't live. So if that is true, then the cell's organ that houses its most important information, which would be the DNA of the cell is what makes you you. So that has to be the brain of the cell, right? That just makes sense. We call that the nucleus. That's where the DNA is housed. So by this, we're saying that the nucleus is the brain of the cell. And so what happens if you remove the nucleus? The cell should die, because without the brain, the cell can't live, just like a human, right? It needs that piece to make it function. So Dr. Bruce Lipton started doing experiments, and he was trying to take the brain out of a cell. He was taking the brain out of a cell to let it die. What he found out was, taking the brain out, he thought the nucleus was the brain, where the DNA was housed. He took the nucleus out of the cell, but the cell didn't die. It kept doing the same things that any other cell would do. It ate, it excreted waste, it ran when poison was introduced. It still had respiration. It still did all of the functions that it normally does. If the cell should die when the brain is removed and it didn't die, so he thought that must not be the brain, right? So he deduced that the nucleus is not the brain. So what is the brain of the cell? So he had to ask a new question. And one piece at a time, he took the different parts of the cell out. And each part he took out, the cell never died. It kept living. It kept doing the same thing that any other cell would do. So every little tiny piece that was in that cell wasn't what was keeping the cell alive. So what was keeping that cell alive? Well, what was left, if you think about it, the last thing he could possibly take away from the cell to see if it was controlling the life of the cell was the membrane surrounding it. For us, that equates to our skin. So he tested his theory, and sure enough, without the skin, without that membrane, the cell ceased to live. He took the membrane off, and the cell died. Why does any of this matter? If the DNA housed inside the nucleus was not what was keeping the cell alive, it doesn't necessarily diminish its importance, so don't get me wrong, but it does make us question, does the function of the DNA control everything that we thought it did? If you can pull the DNA out of the center of a cell and the cell continues to survive, does the DNA itself control all of the things that we've given it credit for? Giving us diseases just because our family had it, right? Controlling all the little things about you, your size, your weight, your height, your eye color, and we always clump those in there together, including weight, right? The size of your body. How about your personality traits? That was clumped in there too. So why did the removal of the skin kill the cell? We've been taught that the genes and the DNA control life, that they determine everything, including physical traits such as height, hair, eye color, weight. You can put all this stuff in there we just said, all the personality traits, and yes, even what diseases you will probably get. But when we removed that, it didn't die. So why should you care? Well, we really never took into account what we were perceiving through the five senses in our skin. We never took into account the environment that the cell was under. We never took into account the environment that the person is in. We never really take into account the environment that you're putting inside your body day after day after day until very recently. So now we know that what we're perceiving through our skin and our senses holds as much importance as what the code in the gene tells the body. The gene is just a blueprint. The DNA is a blueprint of what your body should look like. The expression of that gene occurs when it's introduced to an environment, and different environments will make it express differently. So this is what we know. You take in information that tells your body and the cells what to do next. Based on what you're eating, what you're breathing, what you're putting around you, people around you, negative environments, positive environments, you're telling your body and the cells what to do by placing yourselves in this environment. The food you're eating will tell your body, tell those cells how to express. If you're eating information that your body can't recognize, like chemicals and poison, what do you think your body's going to do? If you're eating information that tells your body to express health because it's getting good information, what do you think your body's going to do? It's interesting to think about it in that tense. The DNA itself, here's another thing we know, the DNA itself is just a blueprint. It's more of a blueprint that originally gave instructions to the body as it was growing in the womb. Right? So the body's growing in the womb, and that's basically what that DNA was for. As you came out into the world, and even in the womb itself, your mother was surrounding you with an environment. You got information from her environment, from what she surrounded you with in the womb, from the people she was around, to the food she ate, to her makeup, right? All the way down the line. Very interesting to look at it like this. So science has basically made a lot of false assumptions based on what they thought was truth. So what they were telling us, they thought at the time was true, and now over time, of course, we've learned it a little bit differently because of experiments that different people have done. And so let's go back to Bruce Lipton for a second. So he was conducting experiments on growing cartilage, and I believe he was doing this in Costa Rica at a school that he was an instructor at. So he's playing around in these petri dishes, and he had the same culture, the same cells from a host into these dishes. So a number of different petri dishes with the same culture in it. And what he did was he induced different environments to that like culture. And what he got was staggering. From the same cultures, by adding a different environment, he got different organ tissues. Instead of just cartilage, which is what he set out to originally grow. When he added a different environment, he got a heart tissue. He added a different environment to the next one. He got lung, he got pancreas, he got bone tissue, he got fat tissue. How interesting is that by adding a different environment to the host, to the original culture, he could get a different outcome. So by adding a different environment, he did nothing to the DNA. He did nothing to alter the blueprint. Remember, these are all the same cells, came from the same host. He merely introduced a new environment and got this different outcome. Remember, let's go all the way back to the beginning, that every cell has all the same information. It starts the same. The difference is the new information it's given through its membrane. If you're a cell, and when that was removed, remember, the cell died. The death was imminent. So it was a big deal that membrane was there to filter that information. If the information is vital and good information, you'll probably, in your body, express life and wholeness. If the information is poison and chemicals, like from our food supply, what are most of our bodies expressing? Diseases. And the name list, like pick your disease title. Most of us have more than one. Why is this happening? Because over the last 50 years, this has gotten worse and worse and worse. It's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. The names of the diseases have become more prominent in our society, the diseases themselves, and even different diseases, things that we've never heard of before. Are they just making up things? Are the doctors just making up things? Or is this like a real occurrence is happening and they're still saying, it's your genetics? So what does this mean? It means that genes do not control your biology. So it's not your genetics. It's not your family trait. It's not a family gene pool that you're getting these diseases from. It's based on the environment. Right? Your environment controls the gene. If you change the environment, you get a different outcome. If you go back through your family history a little bit, whatever they've been doing consistently through your family is what happens consistently through your family. If your family consistently has eaten poor food for a number of generations, so you can go back 3 or 4 and kind of look at that. What have they been doing? When did the diseases actually start appearing in your family lineage? Why all of a sudden are they saying things that are genetic diseases, and all of a sudden you have that title, but it's not in your family history anywhere? So we're seeing flaws in the mentality, we're seeing flaws in the system of what they've been telling us, and it's not because it was part of your genetic predisposition, it was part of the environment that you've been surrounded in. So think about it. What are you bringing into your environment? And perceiving, it's what's influencing your outcome. Think about that. From the food, to the air, to the water, the people that you surround yourself with, positive or negative, the job choices, the stress load, right? It's all very tangible on a real level, especially when you start having disease titles show up. So remember, we said earlier too, the information that tells your body and the cells you get information that tells your body and your cells what to do next. That the DNA itself is more of a blueprint that originally gave instructions to the body as to what to do. Where does this information come from? It comes from all around you, right? If we're talking about the environment, that's where we have to go back and think about what's in your environment. And we know at this point that when people start cleaning up their environments, especially if they're in a disease process, even if it's a mental issue, right? If you've got some kind of crazy mental thing going on, they told us we had bipolar. The list was endless, right? Bipolar, you're depressed, anxiety issues. I'm trying to think of the ones they give the kiddos, all the little initials that they give the kids, ADD, ADHD. But we all of a sudden change their diet. We take out sugar, you take out food coloring, you take out some of the chemicals that are actually causing those reactions, and what do you get? You get a totally different person. You get a totally different kid standing in front of you. Right? So the same way that we're influenced and acting and reacting, just like your cells, they act and react to the information that they've been given. So your food, the things you think, things you listen to, the music, noise, other people. What are you breathing? What are you surrounding yourself with? Think about all the stuff we buy, the lotions, the potions, the makeup, the soaps, the cleansers, and you can look all this stuff up and read all about the different chemicals and the things in it and what they're actually thinking they're doing to our bodies right now. You are a representation of your environment, not of your DNA. You are a representation of your environment, not your DNA. Genes have no control over themselves. They do not self-actualize. Genes do not make decisions. Genes do not take actions. The gene is part of the blueprint. It needs an environment to express. So let's go back for another minute. Remember we said we had learned back in high school that DNA controls our traits, everything from physical looks to personality, even to the diseases that you might get. But now we know the gene is just a gene, that DNA is a blueprint, and the code is a path or direction the cell follows when given information to express. So, if my mom was fat and the DNA is a blueprint, what information am I getting from my environment that tells me to be fat? Totally changed the questioning there. Clearly, that had something to do with the food I'm eating. Right? If I'm eating food that has chemicals and poisons in it, much like the food mass-produced today, food that toxifies a body and food that gives information to a system that is responding to that information. If my body does not know what to do with the food and chemicals that I'm sticking in it, remember, you're a representation of the environment, not of your DNA. And I know I spelled you instead of your. I keep just like glazing over it. It's okay. I'll get it on the next trip through. So if you're a representation of your environment and you're expressing disease, and it doesn't just come from the food. It can come from things that have happened in your past. The diseases can come from massive traumas that have happened. Even small traumas over a period of time can cause disease issues. The things you think, the things you have been told, right? And we'll go into that more and how that works from a brain standpoint, can actually cause disease processes and cause problems and issues throughout the course of your life. So let's go back to that list of potential disease titles and ponder once again where they came from. So let's take asthma this time. I was born with asthma, actually. I came out of the womb having an asthma attack, and I was put into an iron lung. My question at this point isn't what was wrong with my DNA, and I used to actually think that. I remember walking to school talking to myself about why I had to be the one that got the bad DNA. My question is, what was my mom eating, and maybe her family before her or my dad's family, that made me express asthmatic symptoms? I have 3 brothers. They all have had asthmatic symptoms and still do to this day, except one. One of my brothers at a young age was told by a doctor, "Why would you want asthma?" As if it was his decision. This brother is very analytical, and he thinks very literally for the most part, and he took that doctor's information seriously. Why would I want asthma? I remember him telling this story, and I was just like, dang, I wish I would have had that doctor. So the environment created by this doctor was the belief that he didn't have to have asthma. And guess what? He grew up without it. It wasn't until years later, as a 50-something-year-old, that he started to struggle with asthmatic symptoms, because his body is now full of inflammation from an American-style diet and lack of exercise, and he's the first to admit it. So what can somebody saying something do to you? What kind of atmosphere, what kind of environment can that create that can actually stop a disease process? I always loved that story. Like I said, I wish that doctor had told that to me, but I struggled with asthma my whole life until I got the inflammation in my body under control. So I came at it from totally a different end than he did. But when I got the inflammation in my body under control, guess what happened? My asthma magically went away. My environment was successfully changed because I quit eating foods that inflamed my body. So earlier on, I mentioned on a title, I mentioned AIDS. And AIDS has been clearly talked about as an environmental issue since we started hearing about it in the 1970s. We were told people of gay orientation and people who share needles were at high risk based on their environment. So if you're sharing a needle, or if you're in a gay relationship, that's what we were told in high school. People who were not in that environment were not considered at as much of a risk. So clearly AIDS is something that happens because of the environment that people put themselves in. Now, whether being gay or not actually causes AIDS, that's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying this is what we were told early on. So we're talking about probably the mid to late 70s and the early 80s, okay? So this was a while ago. And this is what we were told. This is what we thought, the sharing of needles. And so that's what it was. Here's what I'm thinking now. If we had realized that kind of an attitude with the rest of disease titles, we could have solved so many issues so long ago. If it's just about the environment you put yourself in, if there was less people putting themselves in bad environments, and I'm not saying the gay lifestyle is a bad environment, using needles and sharing needles obviously is. Whatever we thought back then, like much like this stuff, we're proving it wrong every day. But there's 1% of diseases that are actual alterations of the gene. And that's usually at the level of chromosomes. The rest are caused by the environment and by the body expressing information that it was given. It's very interesting when you take a look at it like this. The knowledge that we are a representation of our DNA has caused major issues by the belief of that alone. Let me read that one more time. The knowledge that we are a representation of our DNA has caused major issues by the belief of that alone. Many issues and belief patterns were caused because we believed that we didn't have a choice. We got whatever we were given. It was in your family line or your family genes. That negative mindset that if my family had it, then I'm going to get it, has created an environment in your mind that brings an attitude, a thought, or repetitive thoughts, even a belief base that will breed those diseases and issues. What do you think about that? And even with AIDS, I have to wonder how many, back in the early days when we were taught this, how many gay people were scared to death that their lifestyle was causing a disease. And so the mentality and the mindset that goes along with that. It's a very interesting question. How many times have you heard of someone curing themselves with something like laughter? Laughter is an environmental change if you've just walked out of an office hearing that you're going to die from some crazy disease and you have no way of doing anything about it. It's incurable. We're told that a lot. There's nothing we can do. But they go and start a program of laughing, or they change their nutrition, right? So many different things. Even placebos. What an amazing effect that can have for people. When they think they're getting a cure, even though it's not, and all of a sudden they're totally fine. How about the nocebo effect? Why do these things work? We have to examine the environment in these cases for the particular person involved, because it's going to be different from person to person. What works in one personal environment may not work in another's. Which is why some people can go and do a therapy and get into it and all of a sudden they're totally fine, but the next person is like, that doesn't do anything. And it brings us at odds with each other. Does it work? Doesn't it work? Worked for me, didn't work for me. Who knows? Who cares? That's why you have to go through and do the work and find out what works for you. So know your environment and how it's affecting you. Take some time and think about this. Not think about it. Think about it. You can tell I typed this fast. If you're out of my school of thought and you know that you can rewire your mind, the belief system that you have because of the things that you learned in school or the things that people have told you, the things you've heard in doctors' offices, could be really worthy of balancing, especially if it's left you with a negative underlying tone or illness. Right? So balance these things with a whole brain state, with a whole brain balance, could be a really worthy exercise. So that means you have to kind of go through your environment, spend some time going through it. And whatever your belief system is to your illness, whatever your belief system is to the things that you were taught in school, what kind of things still bother you? I remember having to sit under our desk practicing nuclear fallout attack. And we laugh about it now, but how many people that did, I mean, it was petrifying. The alarms would go off. We would have to run under our desk. I lived in Colorado. Colorado Springs is right down the road. And they said that was going to be ground zero for some of those bombs. Isn't that crazy to think about? Like, what if I balanced that in my system? I wonder what would go away, what would change. And I've never actually thought about that before. So if I was doing that, let me walk you through it real quick. If I was actually doing a balance to something like that, for me, it would be going back into my high school. So I would be looking for a memory of sitting in my high school, hearing the alarm go off, crawling under the desk, listening to everybody around me screaming and hooting and hollering. And of course, we're high school kids, so there was laughter going on too. But there was some kids that this was actually paralyzing for, right? We would talk about what would happen, what the ramifications would be. And now we have Terminator, 1, 2, and 3. So you can actually see the thing as it blows up and blows across the land, just wiping out everything in its path. So I would go through that in my mind, pull it up in my system, feel it in my body. If there's any stresses to it, I would go ahead and go through the whole balance procedure. If I ask myself on a scale of 1 to 10 where that sits in my system when I think about that, I would actually have to say I'm probably a 3 or a 4, which surprises me because that's not what I would want to be. I would want that to just be at a dead 0. It does not bother me at all. But when I feel it in my body, in my system, I want to say that it's probably a 3 or a 4. So that's worthy of balancing those kind of things. What happened in your past, even on the school level, things that you were taught, things that we know now were incorrect, things about food. How many things about food have changed over the years? How much of that is stuck in your system and you can't quite shake it free and move on with your life? and eat healthy and be well? Okay, very interesting questions. So this is your lesson on epigenetics, very basic. There is one more video with this series, and if you scroll down, it should be right underneath here, so you'll find that easily. Blessings and peace as always, and I hope, if you have questions about this, please contact me, Christy@mindrewire.com. I will look for your emails.